today, and you will note a remarkable similarity, even though the library is built to modern architecture, to the layout of the National Hotel. And it's sort of a retro recognition to the history of that spot, so that the library actually somewhat resembles the old National Hotel. So the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad makes an offer to the M&H that can't be refused. Now, thinking that the Union Canal was abandoned and land rights reverted to the previous or adjacent landowners, the Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad had the, quote, owners, unquote, at least they thought they were owners, sign releases giving the railroad use of the canal towpath. And in some cases, they actually had to pay these folks for these releases. In February of 1889, before construction of the railroad began, the M&H directors also incorporated the Middletown and Hummelstown Stone Company. Remember from the beginning of our presentation, we said that one of the reasons for building the railroad was to exploit the limestone and brownstone in the lower Swatara Creek Valley. So the Stone Company leased 25 acres of brownstone land from the Fry Estate north of Fry's Grove. They also leased a quarry about 1/2 mile north of Fooling Mill Road, which still exists today. Then they leased land on the east side of the Swatara Creek north of the Stoverdale Camp Meeting. But on April 9th, 1889, before the grading of the railroad was even completed, the trustee of the Union Canal told the Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad they could not use the towpath without the permission and approval of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, who had foreclosed on the Union Canal. And the Philadelphia and Reading then told the M&H to move the railroad off of the towpath or to purchase the canal property. Well, the directors didn't have the money to do that because they put all their money into the railroad and into the Stone Company. So with their large investment in the stone deposits along the railroad, the M&H directors had no choice but to sell their railroad to the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. So on August 7th, 1890, just a week after they drove that gold spike and were celebrating, a special train brought Philadelphia and Reading Railroad officials to the M&H office at Union and Brown Streets in Middletown. And there, the M&H stockholders sold all their shares to the Philadelphia and Reading for $50 per share, which is the price they bought them for in 1888. So they didn't make any money, but they really didn't lose any money either as far as their stock investment went. And the very next day, the Reading didn't waste any time. On August 8th, 1890, another train powered by steam locomotive number 358, pulling coach number 455, ran over the M&H Railroad from Hummelstown to Middletown, carrying the chief engineer. That would not be the locomotive engineer, that would be a professional civil engineer, the train master, the telegraph superintendent, and a supervisor to prepare for regular train operations. And the Reading immediately began to make several improvements. The track in Middletown was extended to the Middletown Furniture Company, which was located along West Emaw Street and just east of Wood Street, and the Middletown Car Company. And the trestle on the curve on the east side of Swatara Creek Bridge was immediately filled in because the Reading intended to run heavier trains and heavier locomotives. A telegraph line was strung from Hummelstown to Middletown. Remember, this was before there was common use of telephones, so that the dispatchers could communicate with the passenger and freight agents in Middletown of the Reading. And the original M&H engine house was demolished. And in 1891, a brick freight station was built just east of Peony Avenue in Middletown with an office, a storage room, and a scale for weighing small freight shipments. and a cattle pen was built between Race Street and the turntable. Back then there were several barns in Middletown Borough where cattle were kept and bought and sold. And some came in by train and some were shipped out by train. So nowadays you go down the highway and you may see a stock truck. Well, back then there weren't any trucks. Livestock was shipped by train. This is a picture of that freight house. It's an early picture, but we believe that it was certainly taken after 1924 because it says Reading Company Freight Station. It does not say Philadelphia and Reading Freight Station. But you can see that there are several railroad cars lined up there along the loading platform of the station. So it was probably taken in the late 1920s, early 1930s. It seems like they were doing a rather brisk freight business at that time. Now, during the summer of 1891, a waiting shelter and a footbridge were constructed at Stoverdale for the people that did want to attend the camp meeting grounds. And also in 1891, the Reading purchased a building on Union Street and tore it down in preparation for a new passenger station, so people would not need to board the train in the street at Union and Brown Streets. So this is a picture of a northbound train coming out the M&H from Middletown toward Hummelstown, and you'll see the Stoverdale station there. It wasn't anything elaborate. It's similar to a three-sided structure you might see today if you take a drive through the country where it would be a rural school bus stop. But you'll see several ladies there in their finest, waiting either to board the train or to greet somebody that's getting off the train. And you see a crate there that's going to probably be loaded on the train. If you look to the right of the railroad tracks, you'll see one of those telegraph poles that carried the telegraph line from Hummelstown to Middletown. And then immediately behind the ladies there, you'll see another post, which would have been for a flag stop. There was no station agent there at Stoverdale, and perhaps the train didn't stop there all the time, but if you wanted the train to stop, you could pull a chain and put a flag out on the top of that pole. The engineer on the train would see that flag and he'd know to stop the train to pick you up. And the new station at Middletown was built again from stone quarried in the brownstone quarry at Fry's Grove, operated by the Middletown and Hummelstown Stone Company. So those directors were able to recoup some of their investment there, and the Reading was graciously enough to purchase the stone for the construction of their station from them. It was completed in the spring of 1892, and it contained a ladies' waiting room, a men's waiting room, a ticket office, and an express office, and a baggage room. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why were there separate men and ladies waiting rooms for the train? Well, remember, back then we were a highly industrialized society, and there weren't any cars or trucks, so the men that were going to work out in the quarries were going to board the train. Men in the surrounding area, in the countryside, out here in the township, maybe in Hummelstown, were coming into Middletown to work at the American Tube Works, maybe to work at the car works, maybe to work at the stove works. They were hot, dirty, and dangerous jobs. So the men had dirty clothes and dirty shoes, and the women, as you saw on that picture, standing there at Stoverdale, had their fancy, nice, long dresses and everything. So they didn't want to get them soiled sitting on a bench occupied by one of those workmen. Plus, almost all the men back then chewed tobacco. So they were brass spittoons in the men's waiting room for them to spit, but a lot of them missed the spittoon and some of them didn't care and just spit right on the floor. So the women didn't want to see that, plus they didn't want to get, again, their long skirts soiled with the tobacco juice. So there were separate waiting rooms for men and for women. And the ticket office was in between to serve both of them. And then, of course, there was an express office where you could receive and send packages by express on the passenger train, which would be a little faster than sending it down at the freight house, and a baggage room. If you were traveling just like today with your luggage, you would check it at the baggage room, and then the conductor, the baggage master, would put it on the train. So at first, the borough of Middletown refused to approve the new station unless the railroad built an underpass on Poplar Street, so the trains did not block the traffic. But the railroad refused, and the demand was dropped, because I guess they figured it was better to have them go up and board right at Union Street than to have the citizens have to board in the middle of the street at Union and Brown Streets. So here is a picture of the Reading station in Middletown on South Union Street. And some of them people here tonight that are around my age may recognize it from when you were young. On the right side of it, after the railroad sold the station, was Living Good News Agency, which sold newspapers, magazines, tobacco products, candy, and other sundries. And on the left side there, the other door, was Town Cleaners, which was a dry cleaning establishment. And again, why were there two doors? One was for the men and one was for the ladies. This is a picture of the back of the station with a train that was going to board passengers there. And you see that it is in fact blocking Poplar Street. Now behind the train you see a building with a steeple on it, or a cupola. That was the Raymond and Campbell Stove Works. And the steeple was where the bell was housed. So after the program today, there's a better picture up here. If you come up and look at it, you can actually see the bell up there in that cupola or steeple. Remember, this was before electricity was widely available, so to start the workday, they'd ring that bell. They knew when to start their shift. They'd ring the bell for a lunch break. They'd ring the bell when it was quitting time or time for the next shift. The locomotive was what we call a camelback locomotive. If you look at it, it's a little bit different than the typical steam locomotive that you may be used to. You see the smokestack, of course, and the boiler, and then you'll see the cab, but the cab is sitting right on top of the middle of the boiler. That was because the Reading burned anthracite coal from the coal regions, and they needed a nice, long, wide firebox to get that anthracite to burn. So the boiler and the firebox actually extended back toward the rear of the cab, and the fireman actually was on the rear of the locomotive where you see that little overhanging roof to shovel the coal and work the water. Then you had the locomotive tender or coal car, then you had the baggage car, and then one or two passenger cars. You can see some folks there that are walking alongside the train, probably to board, and then you see the house there on the left, which still exists today down on Poplar Street. So the railroad began with a rather robust passenger service. Again, I have to remind you, this was before the age of automobiles. So beginning on August 12, 1890, passenger trains ran each way 6 times daily, Monday through Saturday, and 4 times daily on Sunday. The running time was 35 minutes each way between Middletown and Hummelstown, and the fare was 20 cents. So you may remember just a year before, on August 12, 1889, the original Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad was charging 25 cents just to go from Middletown to Stoverdale. So I guess it's a matter of supply and demand. In 1891, a red-eye ran Saturday nights directly from the Reading station in Harrisburg to Middletown at 11:25 p.m. to bring people home from city events and entertainment. So again, without automobiles, if you wanted some entertainment, you wanted to see a vaudeville show, perhaps attend some type of a concert or some other form of entertainment, maybe an evening ball game, you went to Harrisburg, like a lot of people do today. But remember, you didn't have a car, so if you didn't want to walk all the way back to Middletown, you took the train. So they had this red eye around midnight to bring people back from Harrisburg to Middletown. And frequent service encouraged commuting, and the Reading issued discount 46 trip coupon tickets. So here you see a picture of one of these tickets, and this has a direct relationship here to Lower Swatara Township, because you'll see it was issued to a Mr. Ryder, and he is boarding at Clifton, which is right down here at the end of Fooling Mill Road that we're along right now. And he's traveling from Clifton to Annville every day. So we can speculate that Mr. Ryder was either a student, an employee, or a professor at Lebanon Valley College in Annville. So he was commuting back and forth daily on the train from Lower Swatara Township to Annville and back. But passenger service eventually began to decline. In 1894, service was reduced to 3 round trips daily and no Sunday service, as the Reading and many businesses went bankrupt during the Panic of 1893. So what was the Panic of 1893? Well, most of us have heard of the Great Depression back in the 30s, but there were many depressions over the history of our country from the time it was founded in 1776 right up to the present day. So the Panic of 1893 was one of those times when the stock market crashed. Companies could not make payments on their bonds, and companies were bankrupt. They were foreclosed upon. So the Reading happened to be one of those companies because they overextended themselves. So to save money, they reduced the passenger service on the M&H to 3 round trips daily. And also at that time, this newfangled invention called the trolley car was beginning to affect local passenger service. And again, the next presentation on James Young, he founded a trolley company that actually ran through Middletown and Lower Swatara Township up to Steelton. And the trolley cars were beginning to siphon off traffic from the railroad, especially if you weren't traveling very far. You could take the trolley rather than the train. But in 1896, the Reading began hauling milk on the M&H passenger trains with morning pickups, we know, at Clifton, and we presume there was probably some in Middletown, East Middletown, and Fry's Grove. But the only ones that we have actual documentation on were the pickups at Clifton. So in the 1920s, service was reduced to 2 weekday round trips as highways improved and personal automobile transportation became popular. So we'd already mentioned about the Swatara Creek Road on the east side of Swatara Creek, which most of you are familiar with, and you'll note that that was a narrow concrete road. That road was one of the original, what we called Pinchot roads. When Governor Pinchot ran for office, one of his campaign slogans was to get Pennsylvania out of the mud. So once he was elected, he made good on that promise, and many of these concrete or Pinchot roads were paved because people were in fact now buying their own automobiles. So as people drove, fewer people rode our trains, and so they reduced the number to 2 weekday round trips. Also here you see a picture taken in 1911 of a double-headed train stopping at Stoverdale. By double-headed, we mean the train was long enough that it required 2 locomotives to pull that long train. So again, you can see the Stoverdale Camp Meeting was still very popular in 1911. During the Great Depression, the Reading suspended regular passenger service on the M&H, but to keep the franchise, they attached a coach to the rear of freight trains to Middletown, and this was known as a mixed train. But a special excursion train did run to Middletown in 1937, after stopping at Indian Echo Caverns. Now, the Reading was a rather busy railroad around Philadelphia and surrounding cities that they served, and they hauled a lot of commuters during the week. But on the weekends, a lot of those passenger cars sat idle, so they were looking for ways to make some revenue on the weekends. So they began to run, especially in the 30s, a series of these special excursions that they called rambles to various interesting destinations. And in 1937, one of those destinations was Indian Echo Cave. Now, those trains consisted of two types of passengers. There were families with children, which the railroaders called daisy pickers, that basically just wanted to go to a nice place, get off, relax, have a picnic, maybe go through Indian Echo Cave. And then the other type of passenger was what was known as a rail fan. And some people called them rail fanatics. They were people like some people in this room tonight that liked to ride trains just for the fun of it. They liked the steam locomotives. They liked to cover different track that they never rode on before and take lots of pictures. And those folks insisted that the train run all the way into Middletown. So they left the daisy pickers off at Indian Echo Cave to go through the cave, and then the train went down to Middletown so these rail fans could collect that rare mileage. But passenger service was finally discontinued in 1939, and the Middletown station was sold in 1940. But in a final flurry of passenger specials, the Reading ran two Iron Horse rambles, which took a side trip pulled by diesels on the M&H to Indian Echo Caverns in 1961 and 1964. So next we have a picture of a diesel engine sitting on the M&H just south of US 322 at Hummelstown. They would have run into Indian Echo Caverns. There would have been a long train behind that diesel. And this particular diesel, FP7 number 904, was on one end. Why was there a diesel instead of the Iron Horse? Well, the Iron Horse they were using was a huge T1 engine. It weighed over 400 tons. It probably would have derailed on the Y at Hummelstown, and it would have been much too heavy for the track in Middletown by 1961, which was not in that good a shape. You can see weeds growing up in the track there. So the locomotive was detached at Hershey and run up to Rutherford Yards near Harrisburg for servicing. They put these diesels on to take the train down to Indian Echo Cave. This picture was actually taken by me as a 12-year-old boy. And how did I know that it was there? Well, because all the steam locomotives had left the railroads back in the early 1950s. You didn't hear that steam whistle anymore. But when I heard that whistle in 1961 in Middletown, I knew the train was over in Hummelstown or Hershey, so I asked my dad to drive me over there. Next, we have a picture of that 1937 excursion that ran into Middletown. It had that Camelback locomotive again on it, number 558, and you can see the long train there in what is now the modern M&H yard. It's interesting to note the crew member there standing down by the locomotive, and there's one of those milk cans that the railroad would have run from Middletown over to Hummelstown, where it would be put on a train to Reading or Philadelphia when they still ran the passenger service. If you look all the way up to the end of the train there, you see a nice antique automobile, and then there is a building sticking up on the left. That would be on Brown Street, and that would be part of the Enduro porcelain enameling plant where the Middletown Mini Mall exists today. So in the beginning, the railroad did have a booming stone freight business. So again, those directors that founded the M&H and had to sell to the Reading could still make money off the railroad by selling stone to customers, which was shipped out over the railroad. There were 4 stone quarries that were served with rail sidings for loading cars. The M&H Stone Company had that brownstone quarry at Fry's Grove. Also, the M&H Stone Company had a limestone quarry north of Fooling Mill Road, which still exists to this day under different ownership. Then they had the limestone quarry on the east side of Swatara Creek, north of the Stoverdale campgrounds. And then finally, W.T. Bradley had a limestone quarry on Long Lane in Hummelstown, and a branch siding also reached a lime kiln. So this was big business for the Reading to haul this stone out, especially now that roads were being paved. There was a big demand for limestone for roads as well as building stone. And also there was some inbound freight too, because we know at least at the brownstone quarry at Fry's Grove, which would be in Lower Swatara Township, there was a power plant to run all that equipment. And it would have been powered by coal, so the railroad would have delivered that. We don't have diesel-powered front-end loaders or anything like that. Everything was run by steam, so they probably hauled in heavy equipment like steam shovels and things like that to the quarries. So it was quite a booming business. Also, we had a booming coal business. Now, back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, nearly all the households, businesses, and industries in the Northeast United States used coal. And the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad also had the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company. So I can guarantee you that probably about 100% of the coal that was carried over the M&H came out of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad's own mines. And a coal trestle was built along the M&H south of 2nd Street in Hummelstown. A coal trestle was built on the north side of East Main Street in Middletown, where Germax Electric is now. That later became Espenshades Mill. And after the presentation today, you can come up and take a look at that. Coal trestle was built on just west of Catherine Street for the Raymond and Campbell Stove Works. And another trestle was built right into the main line east of Wood Street for the Middletown Furniture Company, which was also a big customer for the railroad. And the Middletown Borough had an electric power generating station located where what is now Huffer Park. And the M&H built a siding into that to supply coal to that plant. And then a coal trestle was built on the Union Canal right-of-way and still exists, although I think they have vines planted on it now and some swings where Interfaith Apartments are now. Then there were many other freight customers. Raymond and Campbell Stove Works was located at Brown and Union Streets, where Carnes Market is today. They shipped all kinds of stoves to customers all over the United States. And this later became Wincroft Stove Works. So much rail freight was handled that the works had their own locomotive to switch the rail cars. And here is an aerial photograph of the Wincroft Stove Works. You can see how huge it was and how busy it was. It's just a shame that the United States has lost all this industry today. But you can see here that Catherine Street actually crossed the railroad at that time. Now it dead ends down there behind the community building and up the other way, coming just north of Wilson Street. But back then, you could actually walk or drive across the railroad tracks on Catherine Street. So if you look closely, you will see there's a Pennsylvania Railroad freight train, a westbound freight train going by. That long building in the lower portion of the photograph is the Pennsylvania Railroad freight station, and then the train immediately behind it, you see the caboose on the end of the freight train. And then, of course, there were railroad cars parked over there to serve the Wincroft Stove Works on both sides of the works. It was served by both the Pennsylvania Railroad and the M&H Railroad. And if you look on the extreme left of that photograph, you can just catch a glimpse of a very small locomotive there. And that was the switch engine that was used by the stove works to move the railroad cars around as they were needed. It was called a dinky. Also, you'll note there was a watchman's tower there, and you'll see the watchman's job was to lower the gates to stop